Meetings with Remarkable Men, abridged, by Gurdjieff, read by Vincent Bagnall. Gurdjieff has devoted most of his life to teaching a system of knowledge to his pupils when, shortly before his death, he decided to publish the first of 3 books in which he had expressed his ideas, All and Everything, or Beelzebub's Tales, to his grandson. In his own words, the aim of Beelzebub's Tales was to destroy mercilessly the beliefs and views rooted for centuries in the mind and feelings of man, by arousing in the mind of the reader a stream of unfamiliar thoughts. 10 years after his death, his pupils decided to make known the whole body of his ideas, until then accessible only to themselves. A second volume, which represents what Gurdjieff called the second series of his writings, was first published in France in 1960, and it is this book which is now published in English under the title Meetings with Remarkable Men. As Gurdjieff said, his task in this series was to furnish the material required to create the feeling of a new world, a feeling which throws a different light on one's own life. At the same time, this book is written in the form of autobiography and contains the only available information about his early life and the sources of his knowledge. Gurdjieff begins by describing the circumstances of his childhood, particularly the influence of his father, one of the last survivors of an ancient culture handed down by oral tradition. Coming as a boy under the tutelage of the Dean of the Cathedral of Kars, he was given both a religious training and a modern scientific education by men who understood how to cultivate in him a taste for essential values. As he grew up, his urge to understand the meaning of human life became so strong that he attracted a group of remarkable men, among whom were engineers, doctors, archaeologists, and so on, in search of a knowledge that they were certain had existed in the past, but of which almost all traces seemed to have disappeared. He set out with them to explore many countries in the Middle East and Central Asia. With his companions, after many great and unexpected difficulties, he succeeded in finding a very few individuals and isolated communities, each time acquiring fragments of this knowledge, until the moment when the doors of a certain school opened for him, where he came to understand how to bring together all the principles of an esoteric teaching. This school he calls simply the Universal Brotherhood, without telling more. From then on, he proceeded to live these principles, putting them to the test by the strictest inner disciplines till the end of his life. Gurdjieff spoke also of a third series of his writings called Life is Real Only Then When I Am. His aim in this series was to assist the arising in a man's thought and feeling of true representation of the real world instead of the illusory world he now perceives. The third book consists chiefly of talks and lectures which Gurdjieff gave to his pupils, and here he shows the way towards direct work on oneself, points out the pitfalls, and provides means for a better understanding of the inner conditions which are indispensable in the self-development of man. Translator's note: the work of Gurdjieff has many aspects, but through whatever form he expresses himself, his voice is heard as a call. He calls because he suffers from the inner chaos in which we live. He calls us to open our eyes. He asks us why we are here, what we wish for, what forces we obey. He asks us above all if we understand what we are. He wants us to bring everything back into question, and because he insists, and his insistence compels us to answer, a relationship is created between him and ourselves, which is an integral part of his work. For nearly 40 years, this call rang with such force that people came to him from all over the world. But to meet him was always a test. In his presence, every attitude seemed artificial. Whether too deferential or, on the contrary, pretentious, from the first moment it was shattered, and nothing remained but a human creature stripped of his mask and revealed for an instant as he truly was. This was a merciless experience, and for some impossible to bear. These people could not forgive him for having seen through them, and, as soon as they were out of his sight, went to great lengths to justify themselves. This was the origin of the most fantastic legends. Gurdjieff himself was amused by these stories. He even went so far as to provoke them at times, if only to be rid of curiosity seekers, incapable of understanding the meaning of his search. As for those who knew how to approach him and for whom this meeting was a turning point in their lives, any attempt to describe their experience seemed ridiculous. This explains why direct accounts are so rare. The influence he exerted and still exerts cannot, however, be separated from Gurdjieff the man, so it is legitimate to want to know about his life, at least in its main outlines. For this reason, his pupils have felt it right to publish a book, originally intended to be read aloud to a limited circle of pupils and guests. Here, Gurdjieff speaks of the least known period of his life, his childhood, his youth, and the first stages of his search. From the time of his return to the West, Gurdjieff worked unceasingly to gather around him a group of people ready to share with him a life wholly turned towards the development of consciousness. My father was widely known during the final decades of the last century and the beginning of this one as an ashak, that is, a poet and a narrator under the nickname of Adash. And although he was not a professional ashak but only an amateur, he was in his day very popular among the inhabitants of many countries of Transcaucasia and Asia Minor. Ashak was the name given everywhere in Asia and the Balkan Peninsula to the local bards who composed, recited, or sang poems, songs, legends, folktales, and all sorts of stories, in spite of the fact that these people of the past who devoted themselves to such a career were in most cases illiterate, having not even been to an elementary school in their childhood. They possessed such a memory and such alertness of mind as would now be considered remarkable and even phenomenal. They not only knew by heart innumerable and often very lengthy narratives and poems, and sang from memory all their various melodies, but when improvising in their own, so to say, subjective way, they hit upon the appropriate rhythms and changes of rhythm for their verses with astounding rapidity. At the present time, men with such abilities are no longer to be found anywhere. Even when I was very young, it was being said that they were becoming scarcer and scarcer. I personally saw a number of these ashaks who were considered famous in those days, and their faces were strongly impressed on my memory. I happened to see them because my father used to take me as a child to the contests where these poet ashaks coming from various countries such as Persia, Turkey, and the Caucasus, and even parts of Turkestan, competed before a great throng of people in improvising and singing. And this usually proceeded in the following way. One of the participants in the contest, chosen by lot, would begin in singing an improvised melody to put to his partner some questions on a religious or philosophical theme, or on the meaning and origin of some well-known legend, tradition, or belief, and the other would reply also in song and in his own improvised subjective melody. And these improvised subjective melodies, moreover, had always to correspond in their tonality to the previously produced consonances, as well as to what is called by real musical science the Antsapalnianly flowing echo. All this was sung in verse, chiefly in Turco-Tartar, which was then the accepted common language of the peoples of these localities, who spoke different dialects. These contests would last weeks, sometimes even months, and would conclude with the award of prizes and presents provided by the audience, and usually consisting of cattle, rugs, and so on, to those singers who, according to the general verdict, had most distinguished themselves. I witnessed 3 such contests, the first of which took place in Turkey, in the town of Van. the second in Azerbaijan in the town of Karabakh, and the third in the small town of Subatan in the region of Kars. In Alexandropol and Kars, the towns where my family lived during my childhood, my father was often invited to evening gatherings to which many people who knew him came in order to hear his stories and songs. And at these gatherings, he would recite one of the many legends or poems he knew, according to the choice of those present, or he would render in song the dialogues between the different characters. This 21st song was repeated in the course of a night so many times that it was engraved on my memory for life. And in this song it is said, "I will tell thee, Gilgamesh, of a mournful mystery of the gods, how once having met together they resolved to flood the land of Shuruppak. Clear-eyed Ea, saying nothing to his father Anu, nor to the Lord the great Enlil, nor to the spreader of happiness Nimura, nor even to the underworld prince Enua, called to him his son Ubaratat, said to him, Build thyself a ship, take with thee thy near ones, and what birds and beasts thou wilt. Irrevocably have the gods resolved to flood the land of Shuruppak." The data formed in me during my childhood thanks to the strong impressions I received during this discussion on an abstract theme between these two persons who had lived their lives to old age relatively normally, led to a beneficent result for the formation of my individuality, which I first became aware of only much later, namely just before the general European war, and from then on it became to serve for me as the above-mentioned spiritualizing factor. The initial shock from my mental and feeling associations which brought about this awareness was the following. One day I read in a certain magazine an article in which it was said that there had been found among the ruins of Babylon some tablets with inscriptions which scholars were certain were no less than 4,000 years old. This magazine also printed the inscriptions and the deciphered text. It was the legend of the hero Gilgamesh. Now, when I realized that here was that same legend which I had so often heard as a child from my father, and particularly when I read in this text the 21st song of the legend in almost the same form of exposition as in the songs and tales of my father, I experienced such an inner excitement that it was as if my whole future destiny depended on all this, and I was struck by the fact, at first inexplicable to me, that this legend had been handed down by epochs from generation to generation for thousands of years. And yet had reached our day almost unchanged. My first tutor was Dean Borsh, and he was at that time dean of the Kars Military Cathedral and was the highest spiritual authority for the whole of that region, conquered not long before by Russia. He became for me, through quite accidental life circumstances, so to say, a factor for the secondary stratum of my present individuality. While I was attending the Kars Municipal School, choristers for the choir of the Fortress Cathedral were being chosen from among the pupils of this school, and I, having then a good voice, was one of those chosen. From then on, I went to this Russian cathedral for singing and practices. The fine-looking old dean who was interested in the new choir, chiefly because of the melodies of the various sacred canticles to be sung that year, were of his own composition, often came to our practices in loving children. He was very kind to us little choristers. Soon, for some reason or another, he began to be especially kind to me, perhaps because for a child I had an exceptionally good voice, which stood out even in a big choir when I sang second voice, or perhaps simply because I was very mischievous and he liked such rascals. In any case, he began to show an increasing interest in me and soon even began to help me prepare my school lessons. And towards the end of the year, I did not come to the cathedral for a whole week because of having contracted trachoma. And learning of this, the Father Dean himself came to our house, bringing with him 2 military physicians who were eye specialists. My father was at home when he came, and after the doctors had examined me and left, having decided to send an assistant to give me a copper sulfate cauterization twice a day and apply golden ointment every 3 hours, these 2 men who had lived their lives to old age relatively normally, with almost identical convictions, in spite of having received their preparation for responsible age in entirely different conditions, talked with each other for the first time. And from this very first meeting they took to each other, and afterwards the old dean often came to see my father in the workshop, where, sitting on the soft shavings at the back of the shop and drinking coffee made there by my father, they would converse for hours on all sorts of religious and historical subjects. And I remember how especially animated the dean would become when my father said anything about Assyria, about the history of which my father knew a great deal, and which for some reason or another at that time greatly interested Father Borsh. Father Borsh was then 70 years old. He was tall, thin, with a fine-looking face, of delicate health, but strong and firm in spirit, and he was a man distinguished by the depth and breadth of his knowledge, and his life and views were quite different from those of the people around him, who in consequence considered him peculiar. And indeed his outer life gave grounds for such an opinion, if it were only for the fact that, although he was very well off and received a large allowance and the right to special quarters, he occupied only 1 room, in a kitchen in the guard's house at the cathedral, whereas his assistant priests, who received much less than he, lived in quarters from 6 to 10 rooms, with every kind of comfort. He led a very secluded life, mixing very little with those round him and paying no visits to acquaintances, and at that time he allowed no one access to his room except myself and his orderly, who was not, however, allowed to enter it in his absence. Conscientiously fulfilling his obligations, he gave all his spare time to science, especially to astronomy and chemistry, and sometimes for a rest he worked at music, playing the violin or composing sacred canticles, some of which came to be very well known in Russia. I remember very well a specific occasion where the Father Dean said, "In order that at responsible age a man may be a real man and not a parasite, his education must without fail be based on the following 10 principles. From early childhood there should be instilled in the child belief in receiving punishment for disobedience, hope of receiving reward only for merit, love of God but indifference to the saints, remorse of conscience for the ill treatment of animals, fear of grieving parents and teachers, fearlessness towards devils, snakes, and mice, joy in being content merely with what one has, sorrow at the loss of the goodwill of others, patient endurance of pain and hunger, the striving early to earn one's bread." To my great distress, I did not happen to be present during the last days of this worthy and, for our time, remarkable man, in order to pay the last debt of earthly life to him, my unforgettable tutor, my second father. Rest in peace, dear teacher. I do not know whether I have justified or am justifying your dreams, but the commandments you gave me, I have never once in all my life broken. Boguchevsky. Boguchevsky, or Father Evlisi, is still alive and well and has the good fortune to be an assistant to the abbot of the chief monastery of the Essene Brotherhood, situated not far from the shores of the Dead Sea. And this brotherhood was founded, according to certain surmises, 1,200 years before the birth of Christ, and it is said that in this brotherhood Jesus Christ received his first initiation. I met Boguchevsky, or Father Evlisi, for the first time when he was a very young man, and when, having finished his course at the Russian Theology Seminary, he was waiting to be ordained to the priesthood, and was a deacon at the military cathedral of Kars. Although I was still then very young, my relationship with Boguchevsky soon became very friendly. I often went to see him in my spare time, and when I had afternoon lessons, I would often stay after they were finished, either to prepare other lessons or to listen to his conversations with Ponomarenko and with the acquaintances who were always visiting them. Sometimes I helped them in the simple household. Once, during one of our conversations, a lively discussion arose about spiritualism and, among other things, about table turning, which at that time was a subject of absorbing interest everywhere. The army engineer asserted that his phenomenon occurs through the participation of spirits. The others denied this, attributing it to other forces of nature such as magnetism, the law of attraction, autosuggestion, and so forth, but nobody denied the existence of the fact itself. I, as usual, listened attentively, and every opinion that was expressed deeply interested me. Although I had already read a great deal of anything and everything, this was the first time I heard about these matters. And this discussion about spiritualism made a particularly strong impression on me because of the recent death of my favorite sister and my grief over it, from which I had not yet recovered. And in those days I often thought about her, and involuntarily questions arose in my mind about death and life beyond the grave. And what was said that evening seemed to be in response to the thoughts and questions which had unconsciously arisen in me and were demanding a solution. That summer in Alexandropol, I met with another phenomenon for which I could not then find any explanation. Across from my uncle's house was some vacant land, in the middle of which was a little grove of poplars, and I liked this spot and used to go there with a book or with work of some sort. Children were always playing there, gathered from all parts of the town, children of all colors and different races. There were Armenians and Greeks, Kurds and Tartars, and their games made an incredible noise and commotion, which, however, never disturbed my work. One day I was sitting under the poplars, busy with some work ordered by a neighbor for his niece's wedding the following day. My task was to draw a monogram on a shield to be hung over the door of his house, a monogram combining his niece's initials with those of the man she was to marry. I had also to find space on the shield for the day of the month and the year. Certain strong impressions somehow deeply imprint themselves on one's memory. I remember even now how I racked my brains to find the best way to fit in the figures of the year, 1888. I was deep in my work when suddenly I heard a desperate shriek. I jumped up, certain that an accident had happened to one of the children during their play. I ran and saw the following picture. In the middle of the circle drawn on the ground stood one of the little boys, sobbing and making strange movements, and the others were standing at a certain distance, laughing at him. I was puzzled and asked what it was all about. I learned that the boy in the middle was a Yazidi, that the circle had been drawn round him, and that he could not get out of it until it was rubbed away. The child was indeed trying with all his might to leave this magic circle, but he struggled in vain. I ran up to him and quickly rubbed out part of the circle, and immediately he dashed out and ran away as fast as he could. But this so dumbfounded me that I stood rooted to the spot for a long time as if bewitched until my usual ability to think returned, although I had already heard something about these Yazidis. I had never given them any thought, but this astonishing incident, which I had seen with my own eyes, now compelled me to think seriously about them. Looking round and seeing that the boys had gone back to their games, I returned to my place full of my thoughts and continued the work on the monogram, which was not going well but had to be finished at all costs that same day. The Yazidis are a sect living in Transcaucasia, mainly in the regions near Mount Ararat, and they are sometimes called devil worshippers. Many years after the incident just described, I made a special experimental verification of this phenomenon and found that, in fact, if a circle is drawn round a Yazidi, he cannot of his own volition escape from it. Within the circle he can move freely, and the larger the circle, the larger the space in which he can move. But get out of it, he cannot. Some strange force, much more powerful than his normal strength, keeps him inside. I myself, although strong, could not pull a weak woman out of the circle. If a Yazidi is forcibly dragged out of a circle, he immediately falls into the state called catalepsy, from which he recovers the instant he is brought back inside. But if he is not brought back into the circle, he returns to a normal state, as we ascertained, only after either 13 or 21 hours. To bring him back to a normal state by any other means is impossible. At least my friends and I were not able to do so, in spite of the fact that we already possessed all the means known to contemporary hypnotic science for bringing people out of the cataleptic state. Only their priests could do so, by means of certain short incantations. Having somehow finished and delivered the shield, that evening I set off to the Russian quarter where most of my friends and acquaintances lived, in the hope that they might help me understand this strange phenomenon. The Russian quarter of Alexandropol was where all the local intelligentsia lived. Mr. X, or Captain Pagosian. Sarkis Pagosian, or as he is now called, Mr. X, is at the present time the owner of several ocean steamers, one of which cruising among his favorite places between the Sunda and Solomon Islands, he commands himself. By race an Armenian, he was born in Turkey, but spent his childhood in Transcaucasia in the town of Kars. I met Pagosian and became friends with him when he was still a young man, finishing his studies at the theological seminary of Echmiadzin, and preparing for the priesthood. But before I met him, I had already heard about him through his parents, who lived in Kars, not far from our house, and often came to see my father. I knew that they had an only son who had formerly studied at the Temagon Trops, or Theological Seminary of Erevan, and was now at the Theological Seminary of Echmiadzin. Pagosian's parents were natives of Turkey, from the town of Erzurum, and had moved to Kars soon after it was taken by the Russians. His father was by profession a poagi, or a dyer, so a person of this profession can always be recognized by his arms, which are blue to the elbows from the dye that can never be washed off. And his mother, an embroideress in gold, specializing in breast pieces and belts for dejupes, which are special costumes of the Armenian women of Erzurum. Living very simply themselves, they spent all they had to give their son a good education. And Sarkis Pagosian rarely came to see his parents, and I never had an opportunity to see him in Kars. My first meeting with him took place the first time I was in Echmiadzin, and before going there I returned to Kars for a short time to see my father and the parents of Pagosian, learning that I would soon be leaving for Echmiadzin. Asked me to take their son on a small parcel of linen, and I was going to Echmiadzin for the purpose, as always, of seeking an answer to the question of supernatural phenomena, in which my interest not only had not diminished, but had grown even stronger. Once, when I went with a company of pilgrims from Alexandropol for a religious festival to a place on Mount Dajur, known among the Armenians by the name of Amina Pretz, I witnessed the following incident. A sick man, a paralytic from the small village of Paldovan, was being taken there on a cart, and on the road we fell into conversation with the relatives who were accompanying the invalid and talked with them as we went along. This paralytic, who was barely 30 years old, had been ill for the past 6 years, but before that he had been in perfect health and had even done military service. He had fallen ill after his return home from service, but just before his wedding, and had lost all use of the left side of his body. In spite of various treatments by doctors and healers, nothing helped. He had even been specially taken for treatment to Mineral Vodi in the Caucasus, and now his relatives were bringing him here, to Amina Pretz, hoping against hope that the saint would help him and alleviate his sufferings. On the way to this holy place, we made a special stop, as all pilgrims usually do, at the village of Diskiant, to pray at the miraculous icon of our Savior, which was in the house of a certain Armenian family. As the invalid also wished to pray, he was taken into the house, I myself helping to carry the poor man in. Soon afterwards, we came to the foot of Mount Jajur, on the slopes of which the little church with the miraculous tomb of the saint is situated. We halted at the place where the pilgrims usually leave their cars, wagons, and vans, at the end of the carriage road. From there, the further ascent of 1/4 of a mile must be made on foot, and many walk barefoot, according to the custom there, while others even do this distance on their knees or in some other special way. When the paralytic was lifted from the cart to be carried to the top, he suddenly resisted, wishing to try to crawl up by himself as best he could. He was put on the ground and he started dragging himself along on his healthy side. He did this with such difficulty that it was pitiable to watch him, but he still refused all help. Resting often on the way, he finally, after 3 hours, reached the top, crawled to the tomb of the saint, which was in the center of the church, and having kissed the tombstone, immediately lost consciousness. His relatives, with the help of the priests and myself, tried to revive him. We poured water into his mouth and bathed his head, and it was just as he came to himself that a miracle occurred. His paralysis was gone. At first the man was stupefied, but when he realized that he could move all his limbs, he sprang up and almost began to dance. Then all of a sudden, recollecting himself with a loud cry, he flung himself prone and began to pray. Now, all the people there, with the priest at their head, immediately fell on their knees and began to pray also. And then the priest stood up and, amidst the kneeling worshippers, held a service of thanksgiving to the saint. Abram Yelov. Abram Yelov was the next of those remarkable people whom I happened to meet during my preparatory age, and who, voluntarily and involuntarily, served as vivifying factors for the complete formation of one or another aspect of my individuality. I first met him a short time after I had lost all hope of discovering from contemporary people anything real concerning those questions in which I was wholly absorbed. On returning from Ekmiadzin to Tiflis, I had buried myself in the reading of ancient literature. I returned to Tiflis chiefly because I could obtain there any book I wanted. In this city, both then and the last time I stopped there, it was very easy to find any rare book in any language, especially in Armenian, Georgian, and Arabic. When I arrived in Tiflis, I went to live in the district called Diduebe, and from there I used to go nearly every day to the Soldiers' Bazaar, to one of the streets along the west side of the Alexander Gardens, where most of the shops of the Tiflis booksellers were situated. And on this same street in front of the permanent bookstores, small traders or book peddlers used to spread out their books and pictures on the ground, especially on market days. Among these small traders was a certain young Ayazor, who bought and sold or handled on commission all kinds of books. This was Abram Yelov. as he was called in his youth, an artful dodger if there ever was one, but for me, an irreplaceable friend. He was even then a walking catalogue, for he knew innumerable titles of books in almost all languages, the names of the authors, and also the date and place of publication of any book and where it could be obtained. Now, in the beginning, I bought films from him, and later I exchanged or returned those I had already read, and he used to help me find whatever other books I needed. We soon became friends. At that time, Abram Yelov was preparing himself to enter the cadet school and spent almost all of his free time cramming for this. But nevertheless, being much attracted to philosophy, he also managed to read a great many books on this subject. It was owing to his interest in philosophical questions that our close friendship began, and we often used to meet in the evening in the Alexander Gardens or in the Mushtahid and discuss philosophical themes. We often rummaged together through stacks of old books, and I even began helping him on market days in his trading. Our friendship was further strengthened by the following occurrence. On market days, there was a certain Greek who used to set his stall next to where Yelov traded. This Greek traded in various plaster of Paris wares, such as statuettes, busts of famous people, figures of Cupid and Psyche, a shepherd and a shepherdess, and all kinds of money boxes of all sizes, in the form of cats, dogs, pigs, apples, pears, and so forth. In short, in all the rubbish with which it was at one time fashionable to decorate tables, chests of drawers, and special whatnots. One day, during a lull in the trading, Yelov nodded in the direction of these wares, and in his singular way of expressing himself said, "There's something making a pile of money, whoever it is that's making that junk. They say it's some dirty Italian, a newcomer that makes the trash in his dirty hovel. And those idiots, hawkers like that Greek, stuff his pockets full of the money laboriously earned by the fools who buy these horrors to decorate their idiotic homes. And here we stick all day on one spot, suffering in the cold, so that in the evening we can choke ourselves on a piece of stale maize bread to just barely keep body and soul together, and the next morning we come here again and go through the same cursed grind." Well, soon after this, I went up to the Greek hawker, and I learned from him that these wares were indeed made by an Italian, who guarded the secrets of his manufacture in every possible way. "And 12 of us hawkers," added the Greek, "are hardly enough to sell these wares all over the Tiflis." His story and Yelov's indignation stirred me up, and then and there I thought of trying to steal a march on this Italian, the more so since at that time I had to consider beginning some business or other means of earning, as my money was already going like the exodus of the Israelites. I first of all spoke with the Greek hawker, of course intentionally arousing his feelings of patriotism. Then, having composed in my mind a plan of action, I went with him to the Italian and asked for work. To my good fortune, it turned out that just previously a boy who had been working for him had been discharged for stealing tools, and the Italian needed someone to pour the water for him during the stirring of the plaster. As I was willing to work for any pay, I was immediately taken on. According to my plan, I pretended from the very first day to be a blockhead. I worked very hard, almost as much as 3 men, but in other respects behaved stupidly. For this the Italian very soon even took a liking to me and no longer hid his secrets from this young fellow, who was so foolish and harmless, as carefully as he did from others. In 2 weeks I already knew how many of the things were made. My employer would call me to hold the glue, to stir the mixture, and so on, and I thus penetrated to his holy of holies, and soon learned all the little, but in this work very important, secrets. And in this sort of work they are indeed very important. For example, when the plaster is dissolved, one should know how many drops of lemon juice should be added, so that the plaster will not have bubbles, and the articles will come out smooth. Otherwise, the fine extremities of the statuettes, such as the nose, ear, and so on, may have ugly hollows. It is also important to know the right proportions of glue, gelatin, and glycerin for making the molds. A little more or less of anything and everything goes wrong. Knowing only the procedures without these secrets would not enable one to obtain good results. In a word, a month and a half later there appeared on the market similar wares of my making. To the forms which the Italian had, I added several comic heads, which were filled with small shot and served as pen holders. I also put up for sale special money boxes, which sold in great numbers and were christened by me the invalid in bed. I do not think there was a single house in Tiflis at that time that did not have one of my money boxes. Later I had several workmen working for me and 6 Georgian girls as apprentices. Yelov, with great delight, helped me in everything and even stopped trading in books on weekdays. At the same time, Yelov and I continued our own work, the reading of books and the study of philosophical questions. Abram also had a brother, who was then studying in America in Philadelphia, I believe, but his brother he did not like at all, holding the firm opinion that he was a double-faced egoist and an animal without a heart. Yelov had many peculiarities. Among others, he had the habit of always hitching up his trousers, and later it cost us, his comrades, many and persistent labors to break him of this habit. Pagosian often poked fun at him for it, saying, "Ha, and you wanted to be an officer." At the very first meeting with a general, off you'd go, you poor fool, to the guardhouse, for instead of saluting, you'd hitch up your trousers, and so on. Pagosian expressed himself still less delicately. Pagosian and Yelov were forever teasing each other, and even when talking amicably, Yelov would never call Pagosian anything else but salted Armenian, and Pagosian would call Yelov Kachagak. The Armenians in general are called salted Armenians, and the Ayazors Kachagaks. Kachagak means literally stealer of crosses. It seems that this nickname originated as follows. The Ayazors are known to be cunning rogues, and Transcaucasia, there even exists the following definition of them. Boil together 7 Russians, you get 1 Jew. Boil 7 Jews, you get 1 Armenian. But only by boiling 7 Armenians can you get 1 Ayazor. Among the Ayazors, scattered everywhere, were many priests, a majority of whom, moreover, were self-ordained, which was then easily done, living in the environs of Mount Ararat, which marked the boundary of 3 countries, Russia, Turkey, and Persia, and having an almost free right of passage across all the frontiers, they gave themselves out in Russia as Turkish Ayazors, in Persia as Russian Ayazors, and so on. But they not only performed the church ceremonies, but traded with great success among the religious and ignorant people in all kinds of so-called holy relics. In the depths of Russia, for instance, giving themselves out as Greek priests in whom the Russians had great faith, they did a good business by selling things purporting to have been brought from Jerusalem, from holy Athos, and from other holy places. And among these relics were fragments of the true cross on which Christ was crucified, the hair of Virgin Mary, fingernails of St. Nicholas of Myra, the tooth of Judas, which brings good luck, a piece of the horseshoe of the horse of St. George, and even the rib or skull of some great saint. These things were bought with great reverence by naive Christians, especially those of the Russian merchant class. And many were the relics of Ayazor priest manufacture in the houses and innumerable churches of Holy Russia. Because of this, the Armenians, well knowing this brotherhood, nicknamed them and still now call them stealers of crosses. As for the Armenians, on the other hand, they are called salted because they have the custom of salting a child at his birth. I must add, by the way, that in my opinion this custom is not without its use. My special observations have shown me that the newborn children of other races suffer from a skin rash in the places where one usually applies some kind of powder to prevent inflammation. But with rare exceptions, Armenian children born in the same regions do not suffer from this rash, although they have all the other children's diseases. This fact I ascribe to the custom of salting. But Yelov was unlike his compatriots in his complete lack of one characteristic that is very typical of the Ayazors. Although he was very hot-tempered, he never bore a grudge. His anger passed quickly, and if he happened to offend anyone, as soon as his temper cooled, he tried his best to smooth over whatever he had said. He was scrupulously considerate about the religion of others. Once, in the course of a conversation about the intensive propaganda which was being carried on among the Ayazors by missionaries of almost all European countries in order to convert them to their respective faiths, he said, "It is not a question of to whom a man prays, but a question of his faith. Faith is conscience, the foundation of which is laid in childhood. If a man changes his religion, he loses his conscience, and conscience is the most valuable thing in a man. I respect his conscience, and since his conscience is sustained by his faith, and his faith by his religion, therefore I respect his religion. And for me it would be a great sin if I should begin to judge his religion or to disillusion him about it, and thus destroy his conscience, which can only be acquired in childhood. Prince Yuri Lubovedsky. Remarkable and out of the usual run of men was Russian Prince Yuri Lubovedsky. He was much older than I, and for almost 40 years was my elder comrade and closest friend. The remote indirect cause which led to our meeting on life's path and to the close bonds of many years' friendship was the event by which his family had been suddenly and tragically cut short. In his youth, when the prince was an officer of the guards, he had fallen violently in love with a beautiful young girl, similar in character to himself, and had married her. They lived in Moscow, in the prince's house on the Sadovaya Boulevard. The princess died in giving birth to her first child, and the prince, seeking an outlet for his grief, first became interested in spiritualism, hoping to enter into communication with the soul of his dead beloved wife, and then, without realizing it himself, he became more and more drawn to the study of occult sciences and to the search for the meaning of life. He so buried himself in these studies that he entirely changed his former mode of living. He received no one, went nowhere, and withdrawing to his library, applied himself uninterruptedly to the questions relating to occultism, which preoccupied him. One day, when he was particularly absorbed in these studies, his seclusion was broken by the visit of an unknown old man. To the astonishment of all his household, the prince immediately received the old man and, shutting himself up with him in the library, conversed with him a long time. Very soon after this visit, the prince left Moscow and spent almost all the rest of his life in Africa, India, Afghanistan, and Persia. He rarely returned to Russia, and then only by necessity and for a short time. The prince was a very rich man, but he spent all his wealth on searches and on organizing special expeditions to the places where he thought he might find an answer to his questions. He lived for a long time in certain monasteries and met many persons with interests similar to his own. When I first met him, he was already middle-aged while I was still a young man, and from then on until his death we always kept in touch with each other. Our first meeting took place in Egypt at the pyramids, not long after my journey with Pagosian. I had just returned from Jerusalem, where I had earned my living by showing tourists, chiefly Russians, the sights of the city and giving them the customary explanations. In a word, I had been a professional guide. Soon after my return to Egypt, I decided to take up the same profession. I knew Arabic and Greek well, and also Italian, which was indispensable then for speaking to Europeans. In a few days, I had learned everything that a guide needed to know and began, along with the slick young Arabs, to confuse naive tourists. And since I was already well versed in this kind of work, and my pockets were not overflowing at that time either, I became a guide in order to earn the money I needed to carry out what I had planned. One day, I was taken as a guide by a certain Russian, who afterwards proved to be a professor of archaeology named Skridlov. As we were walking from the Sphinx toward the pyramid of Cheops, my employer was hailed by a gentleman with slightly graying hair who called him a grave digger, and, obviously, delighted at the meeting, inquired about his health, and they talked Russian together, but to me my employer spoke broken Italian, not knowing that I spoke Russian. They sat down at the foot of the pyramid, and I sat down not far away so that I could distinctly hear all they were saying, and began to eat my churek. The gentleman who had met us, and who turned out to be a prince, asked the professor, among other things, "Are you really still disturbing the remains of people who died long ago, and collecting the utterly worthless rubbish supposedly once used in their stupid lives? What would you, answered the professor. "This is at least something real and tangible, and not as ephemeral as that to which you have devoted your life, a life which you as a man of health and wealth could have used to the full. You are looking for truth invented once upon a time by some crazy idler. But if what I do contributes nothing to the satisfaction of curiosity, at least, if one wishes, it contributes to the pocket." They talked in this way for a long time, and then my employer wished to go on to other pyramids, and took leave of the prince after arranging another meeting in ancient Thebes. It must be said that I was spending all my free time walking among these places like one possessed, hoping to find, with the help of my map of pre-sand Egypt, an explanation of the Sphinx and of certain other monuments of antiquity. Several days after the professor's meeting with the prince, I was sitting at the foot of one of the pyramids, deep in thought, with the open map in my hands. Suddenly, I felt that someone was standing over me. I hastily folded my map and looked up. It was the man who had accosted my employer at the Pyramid of Cheops. Pale and in great agitation, he asked me in Italian how and where I had obtained this map. From his appearance and the interest he manifested in the map, I at once guessed that he must be that same prince described by the Armenian priest at whose house I had secretly made a copy of it, and without answering his question, I asked him in turn, in Russian, if he were not the man who had wished to buy the map from such and such a priest, and he answered, "Yes, I am that man," and he sat down beside me. Then I told him who I was, and how this map had come into my possession, and how I already knew of his existence. Gradually we entered into conversation. When the prince had become quite calm again, he proposed that we should return to his apartment in Cairo and quietly continue our conversation there. From then on, owing to our common interests, a real bond was established between us. We met often, and our correspondence continued uninterruptedly for almost 35 years. During this period, we traveled together many times in India, Tibet, and various parts of Central Asia. We met the last time but one in Constantinople, where the prince had a house in Pera, which was not far from the Russian embassy, and where from time to time he stayed for rather long periods. This meeting took place in the following circumstances. I was returning from Mecca in the company of some Bukharian dervishes whose acquaintance I had made there, and of several Sarт pilgrims who were going home. I wished to go to Tiflis via Constantinople, then to Alexandropol to see my family, and afterwards to go on with the dervishes to Bukhara. But all these plans were changed owing to my unexpected meeting with the prince. On arriving at Constantinople, I learned that our steamer would stay there for 6 or 7 days. Now, for me, this was most annoying news. To wait for a week hanging about without anything to do was not the most agreeable of prospects. I therefore decided to make use of this time to visit a dervish acquaintance of mine in Brausa, and incidentally see the famous Green Mosque. Going ashore at Galata, I decided to go first to the prince's house and tidy myself up, and at the same time to see the prince's amiable old Armenian housekeeper, Miriam Badji. According to his last letters, the prince should by then have been in Ceylon, but to my astonishment, he turned out to still be in Constantinople and even at home. As I have already said, we frequently wrote, but it was 2 years since we had seen each other, and this meeting was therefore a happy surprise for both of us. I put off my trip to Brusa and even had to give up my plan of going straight to the Caucasus in view of the prince's request that I should accompany to Russia a young woman on whose account his trip to Ceylon had also been temporarily abandoned. That same day I went to the bath, tidied myself up, and had supper with the prince. While telling me about himself, he related with great animation and very vividly the story of the young woman whom I had agreed to take to Russia. As from my point of view, this woman subsequently became remarkable in every aspect. I wish not only to repeat her story, as it was recounted by Prince Lubovedsky, but also to tell something about her later life, based on my personal meetings with her and on my own observations. The more so since the original manuscript in which I had written a more complete description of the life of this remarkable woman, under the title of Confessions of a Polish Woman, has remained in Russia among my many other manuscripts, the fate of which is still entirely unknown to me. The prince told me the following story. A week ago, I was leaving for Ceylon on a ship of the volunteer fleet. I was already on board. Now, among those who were seeing me off was an attaché of the Russian embassy who, in the course of conversation, drew my attention to a certain passenger, a venerable-looking old man. "You see that old man?" he said. "Can anyone possibly believe that he is an important agent of the white slave traffic?" Nevertheless, it is so. And this was said in passing. There was a great bustle on board, and many people had come to see me off. Having no time to pay much attention to the old man, I quite forgot what the attaché had told me. The boat started. It was morning. The weather was fine. I was sitting on deck reading. Near me, romping about, was Jack. Jack was the prince's fox terrier who accompanied him everywhere. A pretty girl passed and patted Jack. Then she brought him some sugar. But Jack never takes anything from anyone without my permission. So he cocked his head at me as if to ask, "May I?" I nodded and said in Russian, "Yes, you may." It turned out that the young woman also spoke Russian, and a conversation was started with the usual questions as to where each was going. She told me she was going to Alexandria to take a place as governess in the family of the Russian consul. But during our conversation, the old man whom the attaché had pointed out to me came on deck and called the young woman. When they had gone off together, I suddenly recalled what had been said about this old man, and his acquaintance with this girl seemed to me suspicious. I began to think, searching my memory. I knew the consul in Alexandria, and as far as I could remember, he could not have needed a governess. My suspicions increased. Our boat had to stop at several ports, and at the first stop in the Dardanelles, I sent 2 telegrams, one to the consul at Alexandria, asking whether he needed a governess, and the other to the consul at Salonika, where the boat was to stop next. And I also confided my suspicions to the captain. In short, when we arrived at Salonika, what I had suspected was confirmed, and it became clear that this girl was being carried off under false pretenses. I found the girl appealing, and I resolved to rescue her from the danger menacing her, to take her back to Russia, and not to start off again for Ceylon until I had arranged something for her. We left the boat together at Salonika, and the same day boarded another which was returning to Constantinople. As soon as we arrived, I wished to send her back to her home, but it turned out that she had no one to whom she could go, and that is why I have been delayed here. Her history is rather unusual. She is Polish, born in the Volyn province, and as a child lived not far from Rovno, on the estate of a certain count for whom her father was superintendent. There were 2 brothers and 2 sisters in the family. The mother died when they were all quite young, and they were brought up by an old aunt. Now, when this girl Vitvitskaya was 14 and her sister 16, her father died, and at that time one brother was studying somewhere in Italy, preparing for the Catholic priesthood. The other had turned out to be a great scoundrel. He had run away from college the year before and was in hiding, so it was rumored somewhere in Odessa. At the death of the father, the 2 sisters and their aunt were compelled to leave the estate. Since a new superintendent had been taken on, they moved to Rovno, and shortly afterwards the old aunt also died, and the situation of the sisters became difficult. On the advice of a distant relative, they sold their belongings and moved to Odessa, where they entered a vocational school to learn to be dressmakers. Vivitskaya was very beautiful, and in contrast to her elder sister, frivolous. She had a great many admirers, among them a commercial traveler who seduced her and took her off to St. Petersburg. As she had quarreled with her sister, she took with her share of their heritage. In St. Petersburg, the commercial traveler robbed and deserted her, and she found herself penniless in a strange city. After many struggles and misfortunes, she finally became the mistress of an old senator, but he soon became jealous of some young student and turned her out. She then got into the respectable family of a certain doctor, who trained her to extend his practice by a very original method. The doctor's wife had met her in the garden in front of the Alexandra Theatre, and had sat down beside her and had persuaded her to come and live with them, and she then taught her the following maneuver. She was to walk along the Nevsky, and when accosted by a man, she was not to put him off, but to allow him to accompany her home, give him diplomatic encouragement, and leave him at the door. He would, of course, ask the porter about her, and would be told that she was the companion of a certain doctor's wife. And as a result of this procedure, the doctor would acquire new patients, who invented some kind of ailment merely to get into his apartment in the hope of a pleasant meeting. Akim Bey. I wish to devote this chapter to my reminiscence of another man, of whom I consider remarkable and whose manner of life in his later years, either by the will of fate or thanks to the laws operating in a self-developed individuality, was arranged down to the smallest detail like my own. And at the present time, this man is in good health from the ordinary point of view, but according to my view, and speaking between ourselves, only his physical body is in good health. It is interesting to note that, contrary to the generally accepted opinion that people belonging to two different nationalities which have been engaged in centuries of racial struggle ought to feel towards each other instinctive hostility and even hate, and in spite of the difference of upbringing and family traditions and religious convictions, nevertheless, between Akim Bey and myself, after our first meeting in early youth in quite unusual circumstances, there gradually arose a close friendship. And later, when through all kinds of trivial incidents our inner worlds had been drawn together like two arisings from the same source, our feeling for each other was like that of brothers. So in this chapter I shall describe my first chance meeting with Dr. Akim Bey, who is respected by all serious persons that know him, as well as by the common run of people who regard him as a great magician and wizard. I will also recount briefly some significant events which took place during our wanderings in the depths of Asia and Africa. At the present time, rewarded for his past merits by many decorations which have proved to be not ephemeral, he somehow lives out his remaining years in a small and insignificant place in Egypt with the title of the Great Turkish Pasha. It must be said that he chose such a solitary spot as his dwelling place for his old age, in spite of having the means to live wherever he pleased and to enjoy all the comforts of present-day life, chiefly because he wished to avoid the importunities of idle people and their curiosity, a property unworthy of man which has become inherent in most of our contemporaries. The first time I met Akim Bey was when he was still quite young. He was a student in a military school in Germany and had come, as he always did, to spend the summer with his father in Constantinople. We were of the same age. Before describing the circumstances in which I met him, I must say that in the period before my first visit to Etchmiadzin and my meeting with Pagosian, related in a previous chapter, when I was still being chased about everywhere like a harassed dog, seeking answers to the questions arising in my brain, which, according to the notions of most contemporary people, had become sick with psychopathy, I also happened to go to Constantinople, drawn by rumors of numerous marvels supposed to be performed by the Dervishes there. And on my arrival at Constantinople, I arranged to stay in the district called Pera, and went from there to visit the monasteries of various Dervish orders. And living at that time in the company of those Dervish zealots, and of course not being occupied with anything practical and thinking about nothing except all kinds of Dervish nonsense, one gloomy day I clearly recognized without any illusions that very soon I would have absolutely no what is called dough. And after realizing this fact, I went about for a couple of days, far from carefree, with all the time thoughts swarmed beneath my cranium like the favorite flies of Spanish mules, about how to get hold of that contemptible something which for contemporary man is almost the sole stimulus of his life. With these worries, I was standing one day on the large bridge between Pera and Stamboul. Leaning on the parapet, I began to ponder on the sense and significance of the continuous movement of the whirling dervishes, which at first glance seems automatic and without any participation of the consciousness. And under the bridge and near it, steamers were constantly passing and small boats plied unceasingly in every direction. On the Galata shore next to the bridge, there was a landing stage for the steamers crossing between Constantinople and the opposite shore of the Bosphorus. Near this landing stage, around the arriving and departing steamers, I saw boys swimming about and diving for coins thrown by people from the steamers. This interested me a great deal, so I went nearer and looked on, and without any hurry the boys very skillfully retrieved the coins thrown by the passengers in different places, without missing a single one. I watched for a long time, admiring the ease and dexterity of these boys, who were of various ages, from 8 to about 18, and suddenly the thought entered my head, why should I not also take up this profession? Am I any worse than these boys? And on the following day I went to the shore of the Golden Horn, to a place just below the Admiralty, to learn how to dive. I was put in a wing of a house, and an old woman named Fatma Baji was appointed to take care of me. The Pasha's son, a student in a German military school, also came and helped the old woman after me, and this was Akim Bey, who later became my bosom friend. And while I was getting better, we conversed and chatted about all kinds of things, but gradually our talks began to take a philosophical turn, and when I had recovered, we parted as friends, and from then on kept up an uninterrupted correspondence. That year he left the military school in Germany to enter medical school, as his inner convictions had changed during this time and impelled him to give up his military career in order to become an army physician. 4 years passed. One day in the Caucasus I received a letter from him in which he wrote that he was already a physician and would like to see me, and at the same time to visit the Caucasus, which had interested him for a long time, and he asked when and where he could meet me. I was living that summer in the town of Saram, where I was at work making objects in plaster of Paris, so I sent him a telegram that I was impatiently awaiting his arrival. A few days later he came. That year Pagosian, Yelov, and Karpenko, who had been a friend of my boyhood, also came to Saram to spend the summer. Akim Bey soon became intimate with these comrades of mine and felt like an old friend of theirs. We spent the entire summer in Saram, from where we frequently made short excursions, usually on foot, and we climbed the Saran mountain pass and explored the environs of Borzam and Mikhailov in order to come in contact with the people in these places who had not yet been exposed to the effects of contemporary civilization, and once we even visited the famous Kevsurs, who have driven all the learned ethnographers mad. Akim Bey, living several months in such conditions with us, young men of his own age were already thoroughly stuffed with all kinds of Don Quixotic aspirations, and taking part in all our exchanges of opinion, was willy-nilly drawn into our psychopathy, and like us burned with eagerness to jump over his own knees. The four of us, Pagosian, Yelov, Karpenko, and I, were at that time having many discussions about a proposal made to us a short time before by Prince Lubovedsky to join him and his friends in a big expedition on foot, starting from the frontier town of Nakhchivan and crossing Persia to the Persian Gulf. And these discussions of ours and all the perspectives opened up by this kind of travel interested Akim Bey so much that he asked us to put in a word with the prince for him to be allowed to join this expedition, and he began to think about how to obtain his father's permission and a year's leave of absence from his superiors. The upshot of all this was that after making the necessary arrangements, partly by telegram and partly in person on his return home to prepare for this long journey, he began his first big expedition in our company on the day we set out from Nakhchivan, the 1st of January of the following year. We started at midnight from Nakhchivan, and by morning were already exposed to a demonstration of the wisdom of those biped inhabitants of our dear planet who are called frontier guards, and who are everywhere equally highly developed in the art of expressing their perspicacity and omniscience. Our journey to the town of Tabriz, which we reached 10 days later, passed without any special incident, but not long after leaving Tabriz, an event occurred which I will still describe in as much detail as possible, not merely because Akim Bey took an active part and manifested a deep interest in it, but also because it turned my own outlook on life completely upside down. While in Tabriz, we had heard a great deal about a certain Persian Dervish, supposedly a performer of extraordinary miracles, and our interest was aroused. A little later in our journey, we again heard him from a certain Armenian priest, and we then decided, although he lived in a place a good deal out of our way, to change the route we had planned in order to see him and find out for ourselves who and what he was. It was on the 13th day of a tiring journey, during which we spent the nights in the huts of Persian or Kurd shepherds or in small settlements, that we finally reached the village where this dervish lived. We were directed to his house, which was some distance beyond the village. We immediately made our way there and found him near his house in the shade of some trees, where he usually spoke with the people who came to him. We saw a man of fairly advanced age, dressed in rags, barefoot and seated cross-legged on the ground. Near him sat a number of young Persians who, as we discovered later, were his pupils. We approached, asked his benediction, and also seated ourselves on the ground, forming a half-circle round him. Our conversation began. We put questions and he answered us, and in his turn he asked us questions. At first, he received us rather coldly and showed little inclination to talk, but later, when he found that we had come a considerable distance, especially to talk with him, he became more cordial. He expressed himself very simply in unpolished language, and at the beginning gave the impression, at least to me personally, of being an ignorant man, that is to say, uneducated in the European sense of the word. The conversation with the dervish was conducted in Persian, but in a particular dialect which none of our company knew except myself, Dr. Sari Agli, and one other who was not very fluent in it. Consequently, Sari Agli and I asked the questions, immediately translating all that was said for the benefit of the others. It was dinner time. A pupil came bringing the dervish his food, rice in a bowl made out of a gourd. Continuing the conversation, the dervish began to eat. Now, as we had eaten nothing since we had risen and started on our way early in the morning, we opened our knapsacks and began to eat also. I remind you that at that time, I was an ardent follower of the famous Indian yogis and carried out very exactly all the indications of what is called Hatha Yoga. And when eating, I tried to masticate my food as thoroughly as possible. So, long after everyone, including the old man, had finished their simple meal, I continued slowly eating, trying not to swallow a single morsel without masticating it according to all the rules. Now, seeing this, the dervish asked me, "Tell me, young stranger, why are you eating like that?" I was so sincerely astonished by this question, which seemed to me very strange, and to say not very much for his knowledge, that I even had no desire to reply to him, and thought that we had made such a long detour in vain to meet a man who was not worth talking with seriously. So looking into his eyes, I felt not only pity but also ashamed for him, and replied with self-assurance that I chewed my food carefully so that it might be better assimilated in the intestines. And referring to the well-known fact that properly digested food gives the organism a larger quantity of calories necessary for all our functions, I repeated all that I had extracted from various books on the subject. Shaking his head, the old man slowly and with conviction uttered the following saying, which is known throughout Persia: "Let God kill him who himself does not know, and yet presumes to show others the way to the doors of his kingdom." After that, Sari Agli put a question to the dervish, which he answered briefly. He then turned again to me and asked, "Tell me, young stranger, you probably also do gymnastics." I was in fact working very hard at gymnastics at that time, and although I knew all the methods recommended by the Indian yogis, I kept to the system of the Swede Mueller. I told the dervish that I did work at gymnastics and considered it necessary to practice twice a day, morning and evening, and I explained briefly the kind of exercises I was doing. And this is only for the development of arms, legs, and in general, the external muscles, said the old man. But you have also inner muscles, which are not affected at all by your mechanical movements. Yes, certainly, said I. Good. Let us now return to your way of chewing your food. The old man continued, "If you chew in this way as a means to health, or for the sake of other attainments, then I shall have to say, if you would like to know my sincere opinion, that you have chosen the worst possible way. By chewing your food so carefully, you reduce the work of your stomach. Now, you are young and everything is all right, but you are accustoming your stomach to do nothing. And when you are older, owing to the lack of normal work, your muscles will be, to a certain extent, atrophied, and that is bound to occur if you continue this system of chewing. You know that our muscles and body get weaker in old age. Now, in addition to the natural weakness of old age, you will have another brought on by yourself because you are accustoming your stomach not to work. Can you imagine how it will be then? On the contrary, it is not at all necessary to masticate carefully. At your age, it is better not to chew at all, but to swallow whole pieces, even bones if possible, to give work to your stomach. I can see that those who have advised you to practice this mastication, and also those who write books about it, have heard a bell without knowing where the sound came from." Well, these simple, obvious, and consistent words of the old man made me completely change my first opinion of him, and until then I had put questions to him out of curiosity, but from that moment I felt a serious interest in him and began to listen with the greatest attention to everything he said. But suddenly I understood with the whole of my being that ideas I had hitherto accepted as indisputable truths were incorrect. I realized that up till then I had seen things only from one side. Now, many things appeared in quite a new light. Hundreds of new questions arose in my mind concerning this subject, and carried away by our conversation with the Dervish, the doctor and I quite forgot about the rest of our comrades and stopped translating what was said. Seeing how deeply we were interested, they kept interrupting us with the questions, "What did he say? What is he talking about?" And each time we had to put them off, promising to tell them everything in detail later. So when the Dervish had finished speaking about artificial mastication and the different means of assimilating food and its automatic transformation in us according to law, I said, "Be so kind, Father, and also explain to me what you think of what is called artificial breathing. Believing it useful, I practice it according to the instructions of the yogis, namely, after breathing in the air, I hold it a certain time and then slowly exhale it. Perhaps this is also not to be done?" Well, the Dervish, seeing that my attitude towards his words had completely changed, began to be more in sympathy with me and explained the following. "If you harm yourself with your way of chewing food, you harm yourself 1,000 times more by the practice of this breathing. All the exercises in breathing, which are given in books and taught in contemporary esoteric schools, can do nothing but harm. Breathing, as every sane, thinking man should understand, is also a process of feeding, but on another sort of food. Air, just like our ordinary food, entering the body and being digested there, disintegrates into its component parts, which form new combinations with each other, as well as with the corresponding elements of certain substances which are already present. In this way, those indispensable new substances are produced which are continuously being consumed in the various unceasing life processes in the organism of man. You must know that to obtain any definite new substance, its constituent parts must be combined in exact quantitative proportions." After meeting with these remarkable men, my whole inner and outer world became, for me, quite different. In the definite views which had become rooted in me in the course of my whole life, there took place, as it were, by itself, a revaluation of all values. Before these meetings, I was a man wholly engrossed in my own personal interests and pleasures, and also in the interests and pleasures of my children. I was also occupied with thoughts of how to best satisfy my needs and the needs of my children. Formerly, it may be said, my whole being was possessed by egoism. All my manifestations and experiencings flowed from my vanity. The meeting with Father Giovanni killed all this over the years gradually. And from then on, there gradually arose in me that something which has brought the whole of me to the unshakable conviction that apart from the vanities of life, there exists a something else